Okay. What I'd like to look at during this talk then is uses of technology in low resource contexts. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of projects that have been carried out in various countries and by various teachers. But when we talk about using technology, probably one of the first words that springs to mind is this one, the digital divide. If you've heard this expression before, the digital divide, could you put up your hand? Okay, yeah, some of you have heard that. Okay, so the idea that there is a division between people who have technology or access to technology and people who don't. And often when we talk about the digital divide, we imagine a geographical divide. So developed countries, in theory, have access to technology, and developing countries have less access to technology, in theory. But the digital divide is a lot more complex than that. This divide between developed and developing has become less clear with the advent of mobile devices. I know Gavin asked you yesterday in his plenary who didn't have a mobile phone, and I looked round and I didn't see anybody put up their hand. Not necessarily a smartphone, but some kind of mobile phone. Mobile phone ownership is very, very high in most developing countries, and it's becoming higher and higher. If we look at the second point on the slide here, another digital divide is that between urban areas and rural areas. So within countries themselves, whether they're developed, whether they're developing, there's often a divide between urban areas and rural areas, with usually less access in the rural areas. The third point there is the idea of gender. Again, this is going to depend, but often access to technology is affected by gender. For example, there was a study done in Canada recently, 2013. Canada, you would think everybody has access to technology, right? Not so. A fairly big divide between rural and urban areas, and also in gender, with men usually having more access than women, even in countries like Canada. Interesting. There's a digital divide possibly in classrooms. So some classrooms have maybe some kind of technology, maybe a computer in the classroom. Many classrooms don't, and that can be within the same school even. There's a divide between access to technology in homes. Some homes have, some homes don't, but also in the way technology is used in homes. So again, a study in the United States, for example, found that where homes focused on technology for entertainment and possibly for shopping, there was a different level of familiarity or literacy with technology than in homes where technology was used for more educational purposes. So that's another interesting divide to keep in mind. There's a divide between teachers who can use technology effectively in the classroom or out of class, and those who use it less effectively. And this obviously has to do with teacher skills and teacher training and so on. And I've put a couple of references there for you if you're interested in reading articles on this angle of the digital divide. And then the last point on the slide is this idea of digital natives and digital immigrants. And again, Gavin mentioned this in his talk yesterday. And I think these days the term digital native, we take that a little bit less seriously. Because although young people may be comfortable with technology, they're not particularly critical users and often not that effective users of technology, certainly not within education. So a term that is now used more, I think, and is probably more accurate, is this idea of a digital resident. Not digital native, but digital resident, where it's like you live online, you have a presence online, you use social media. So we have the immigrant native idea is kind of a bit old-fashioned now, and we've replaced it with this idea of a resident. And what's the opposite of the resident? I can't quite hear you, but I think somebody said it, visitor. a digital visitor. So a digital resident is that you have like a house, if you like, online. You have a presence, you use social media. A digital visitor, I think most people use technology for something. A digital visitor maybe just uses email, maybe just goes online occasionally to buy something, but is not a very regular user of technology. That's more accurate, I think, to describe how we use technology in 2016. Prensky's term comes from 2001, so it's quite dated. Okay, that's the kind of theory part, the digital divide. So when we hear the term digital divide, we need to be a little bit careful. It's a nuanced term. It can mean lots of different things in different contexts. And within one particular context, there can be a divide, even within a home or within a school or within an urban area, within a town. Okay, I'm going to give you a moment to consider these three statements with the person next to you. Do you agree or disagree? Why do you agree or why do you disagree? I'll just give you 1 minute to quickly discuss this with the person next to you. Oh, it's very silent. Quickly discuss with the person next to you. You're ready? Okay, thank you. Just to give me an idea of your thinking on this, the first one, you need the latest technologies to carry out good tech-based lessons or activities. Just generally, agree or disagree? Okay, we had some agrees, some disagrees. That's great. The second point, technology is too expensive to use in English as a foreign language classrooms in many contexts. Agree or disagree? Good, we have a mix there again. Perfect, that's exactly what I want, a bit of a mix. And the last one, using technologies effectively requires a non-traditional approach to teaching. Agree or disagree? Again, it seems like mostly agree, but some disagree. Interesting. We're going to come back to these questions after I've shown you a number of projects of how technology is used in low-resource contexts. And we'll see if your thinking has changed on these points. So I'm going to show you a number of projects in three sort of areas. We're going to start with the big picture, the macro level, a couple of national projects carried out on a countrywide scale. Then I'm going to show you an example of a project carried out within an institution, in fact across a chain of schools. And then finally I'm going to show you a couple of projects carried out by individual teachers with their students. All of them in so-called low-resource contexts, just to give you a flavor of what's happening out there in the world of English language teaching and technology. Okay, we've got three national projects I want to just quickly describe to you. The first one is the English in Action, or BBC Jamela project, which is being carried out in Bangladesh. That started back in 2008. It has two sections. The English in Action part is aimed at primary and secondary schools, and the so-called Janala part, or BBC Janala part, is aimed at adults. And Janala in Bangla means window. Now, this is a huge project. It started in 2008. It's across the whole country. It's been put in place by non-governmental organizations, NGOs, the BBC, of course, the Ministry of Education in Bangladesh, and then state television, newspapers, and all of the mobile phone operators in Bangladesh, of which there were 6, or there are 6. I mean, I can just imagine the project meetings must have been a complete nightmare with all of those people involved. So it's a big deal. It's a huge initiative. The timeline was 2008, started, as I said, and it's due to kind of reach the end of its rollout by 2017, so next year. Basically, it's a way of delivering English language learning materials to people in Bangladesh. The adult part, the BBC Jamela part, they use television, they use newspapers, they have like TV soap operas in English, made very much for the local context. They have phone-in English lessons. You can have stuff delivered to your mobile phone, not smartphones, because of course in Bangladesh most people have very low-end, basic mobile phones, okay? We're not talking smartphones. This is really quite interesting. The numbers of this project are extremely interesting. The idea behind the Jamela project is to reach, listen to this, 25 million people by 2017. Not bad. By 2015, so last year, they had reached 24 million, which is pretty good. Of those 24 million, 6.8 million people were regularly engaged with the English language learning materials, and television turned out to be the most popular medium, especially for women and for lower socio-economic groups. Of this 24 million, 8.8 million felt that they'd learned some English, and 7.7 million said they had used the English that they had learned. These are extraordinary numbers, I think. Generally, users reported feeling more confident with English and also more motivated with English. So that was the adult project. The primary and secondary school initiative, which is the English in Action project, basically teachers were given Nokia phones, you know, the low-end Nokia mobile phones, and on those phones they had SD cards, so little kind of memory cards in the phones, which had audio materials in English, so that the teachers were able to take these phones. They were given little small portable speakers. All of this was paid for by the Ministry of Education, the NGO, etc., etc. They could take these materials into class, and they were able to give language learners access to, English in regions where there was, practically no electricity. So it was a very interesting way of bringing technology into rural areas where there was literally nothing, and kids had no exposure to English before. Interesting. What they found there was that there was some resistance among the teachers to this kind of new way of teaching, because it wasn't just audio materials, they also had lesson plans to help them. There was teacher training put in place also to help the teachers with this, how to deal with the audio materials. And they found that really teacher training was a key in this project, that they needed to have a lot of it to make sure that the project actually worked. So that's maybe, I think, probably one of the biggest projects that I know about where technology has been brought into a very low resource context. English in Action, BBC Jamela, Bangladesh. Now, there's a second project there on the slide, which is the Learn English SMS project in Libya and Sudan. And there it is. I can't actually read that. I don't know what it says. I don't read Arabic. What does it say at the top there, that big writing? Okay, so about learning English, yeah? Are you ready to learn English, or, yeah? Oh, the easy way, all right. The fastest and easiest way to learn English, okay. Now, this is an interesting project. It's actually, the British Council is the main partner in this one, and it's being offered in a similar way in Sudan and in Libya. It started off in the Sudan in 2009, and it started in Libya in 2013, so a bit more recently. The basic idea is this, that grammar, vocabulary, and study tips are sent via SMS message to your mobile phone. So you, as a Sudanese person or Libyan person, if you want to brush up your English skills, you can subscribe to this program and you receive on your phone grammar, vocabulary, and study tips. You receive 4 to 5 messages a week. In the Sudan, they have an optional extra where you can request quiz questions that you receive, again, on your phone, and then you get automatic feedback when you answer. The numbers are interesting. In Sudan, they're getting about 65,000 subscribers per month. And in Libya, they got 20,000 subscribers in the first month. Not bad. Now, the reason they can do this is because there's an agreement with the mobile phone operators in these countries, whereby the cost of this text messaging is kept as low as possible to make it accessible for people. So, for example, in the Sudan, it's about 3 US cents per message. And in Libya, the costing is done per month, and it's about $2.40 a month. I'm not even going to try and translate that into dinars. I'll leave that for you. And the aim is to make this a kind of partial cost recovery project. Now, the findings are also quite interesting. So the subscribers, the people who are subscribing to receive the text messages to improve their English, they like this idea of receiving regular messages. And, interestingly, they like the kind of passive role, because you kind of get the English, right? It's just given to you, and then you can respond if you do the quiz questions. So it seems particularly well suited, this model, to the kind of overall, perhaps, learning culture, if you like. The way people have traditionally learned in these contexts is to kind of receive information. It's quite well suited to that model, and it's also, economically and technologically, it fits what is possible in these contexts, because very low-end mobile phones can be used. So that's another interesting project that is happening, in this part of the world. Okay, let's move back to Asia. And this is a wonderful project. It's my absolute favorite one. It's a mobile phone-based project again, but this time in India. And it was set up by the Carnegie Mellon University in about 2009, 2010, I think, originally. It's a very interesting project. The idea is that kids are given these very low-end cell phones, and they have certain English language learning materials preloaded. But I'm going to show you a very short video of this project to give you an idea of how it works. So let's see if we can get some audio.
Rapidly growing access to mobile phones is drastically changing India's rural landscape. The nearly 300 million cell phone subscribers can now connect with family members across the country. Farmers can easily find weather information. And a unique education program is giving every cell phone user access to language lessons. Digital reporter Karen Russo has more from Kannur, India.
They may look like they're text messaging or playing video games, but these children are learning English on their phones. In their poor rural village, good English teachers are hard to come by, but cell phones are relatively cheap, about $30. Anuj Kumar, a computer programmer, helped design the lessons which focus on building vocabulary.
It's difficult to get quality teachers because of the small amount of wages. So what you do is basically you have technology to supplement education.
To make the learning easier, Kumar observed the kids playing traditional Indian village games and then translated them into mobile phone programs.
So once we had the phones, out in to the kids in the village, they realized, that these games are actually good.
Twice a week, 12-year-old Deepak Rodita and 17 other youngsters meet at a local school to upload English lessons onto their phones. Deepak knows what he wants to be when he grows up. And for that, he needs to know English, because medical school in India is taught in English. They may be from small towns, educators here tell us, but they can't afford to think small.
If they want to go ahead in life, if they want to go to cities, if they want jobs that pay well, then they need to have English.
Mobile phones, of course, are transportable, which means kids can take this phone anywhere so that everywhere becomes a classroom, including this field where they often work. And the children are determined to support their families. They often must skip school. But the new English program is helping to change that. For the World News webcast, Karen Russo, ABC News, Kannur, India.
Yes, isn't that a wonderful project? I love that. It's so simple. Low-end mobile phones in the hands of kids. And that's, of course, what the expense is behind the project, apart from developing the content, buying the phones for the kids. But these are cheap phones. Now, this project is particularly interesting because what we see here is kind of, how it ended up. But originally, they tried to use learning materials that were based around, ideas that came from the sponsor, Carnegie Mellon University. Their developers created games, but they were very Western-oriented games, and they found there was a lot of resistance to the kids using these phones for learning English, especially from the parents. But you'll see that the second round of development had Mr. Kumar, who was speaking on the video, and he decided to create, or the team decided to create learning materials based on traditional Indian village games. And this had a completely different reception from the parents. The kids loved everything, but the parents were more open to accepting these games when they were linked to the traditional culture. Very interesting lesson there about developing mobile learning materials in the English language for different contexts. Another fascinating thing in this particular project was they did a pilot phase and they found out this thing about the games. But another interesting thing happened in the pilot phase. The Nokia phones that they were using, some of the phones, the batteries were exploding. And the batteries were exploding because of exposure to extreme heat. But extreme heat. So not like, the weather. It was something much, much hotter. And they couldn't figure this out. How come some phones, the batteries were exploding? Where was this heat coming from? And then they looked at whose phones were exploding. And the phones that were exploding belonged to girls. And they figured out that what was happening in some cases, not all the girls, when they were given phones, often the brothers or the older brothers or the boys in the village would take the phones away from them. And so what they were doing was they were hiding their phones in the one place the brothers were never seen, in the kitchen, behind the stove. So they were exposed to this extreme heat because they were right behind where the cooking was happening. No boys were ever around to be doing the cooking, so the mobile phones were safe. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, this project then has been going on for a number of years now and seems to be fairly effective. At least it's giving exposure to English language materials to kids who had nothing before. Okay. Let's move on to institutional projects. So we've looked at national projects, kind of huge projects with funding from NGOs, universities, and so on. Now let's look at one project that was set up by an institution. So a school, a language learning school. In fact, a series of schools. I think they have, 5, 6, 7 branches of this school in Brazil. And what they decided to do was to invest in tablets for the students. So they managed to get, it's a private school, but they also have a part of the school which is scholarship-based for underprivileged children, a fairly large percentage. So they managed to get funding from a local non-government organization to provide a set of about 20 tablet computers for the school. So it wasn't that each child had a tablet computer, right? The school had 20 tablets and then they would use them in different classes. This particular school, they used iPads, which are probably the most expensive tablets. Of course, you can do this kind of project with much cheaper hardware, much cheaper tablets. We're going to watch another very short video in which the lead project person describes how they introduced this at an institutional level. And while you're watching, just look at some of the advice that she gives for teachers interested in trying this kind of thing within a school. It goes for a school, but of course it also goes for individual classes.
We have 40 iPads in 2 different school branches. The main goal is to enhance classes with technology in a way that it's meaningful for students. It's a student-centered classroom. We still have just the 2 sets of iPads, like 20 in every school branch. We are still in the piloting phase because we want to extend that to all our school branches. We have 6. So in this phase, the main goal is to make teachers comfortable with the technology and work with them in the sense that they should use the iPad for student production, not just reproduction of what they did in the past with the books. We have Mac Fridays, which is really great. It's really informal. We have different levels of digital proficiency. So the more experienced ones work with the less experienced ones. Plus, it's a blended type of training. So online, we have a wiki where we post like the students' projects, apps, ideas, lesson plans, everything. At first, of course, it's training the teachers and making them feel comfortable and willing to give it a try. And the technological infrastructure. We still have problems with the Wi-Fi in my school. First, I think we need to study a lot, like in terms of how the logistics is going to be. So what do you want to achieve with this learning project? Second, you need to involve a team to buy the idea and really to make them feel comfortable so that they can multiply good practices. And the third piece of advice is to take the consultancy course. It's really helpful.
Okay, Carla and her team did an online course with us before they started the project, which reminds me, if you're interested in the online teacher training courses that Gavin Dudney and I offer with the consultancy, there is some information here at the front, and please help yourself when the talk is finished if you're interested. I think the 2 important things, though, that Carla talks about is, first of all, training, whatever it might be, not just initial training, but then this idea of ongoing training. So she talks about Mac Fridays, because they were using iPads, yeah, which is Apple Mac. So Mac Fridays, where they have these regular in-house teacher development sessions. I think that's extremely important. And all of the mobile projects that we've worked on with various institutions, teacher training is key, and the other thing is, of course, infrastructure, if you're going to be doing learning activities that require connections, which is not always necessary. In my workshop tomorrow, I'm going to be looking at activities you can do with mobile devices, low-end devices and smartphones, but also activities that don't necessarily need internet connections. But if your school is going to embark on this kind of project, the technological infrastructure also should be in place first. Not always the case. Okay, so that's an institutional example. And now I want to show you again 2 of my absolute favorite individual projects. So these are individual teachers doing really interesting stuff with their own classes. One of them is looking at how to use podcasts, and the second one is looking at Skype interviews. So let's start with podcasts. This lady in the picture here is Nergiz Kern. She works in Turkey, and she's obviously English as a foreign language teacher. Now, she teaches all different ages, kids, adults, and she had a particular group of students, adults, who were taxi drivers in the city that she lived in Turkey, in Bursa, in fact. And she found the problem was that although her school, a private language school, was offering the classes to the taxi drivers for free. It was funded by the Ministry of Education. Sometimes they would come to class, sometimes they wouldn't come to class, sometimes they were working, sometimes they weren't working. So she decided to create a series of podcasts. Podcasts are just short audio files. So she created these short audio recordings and she put them online for her students. And the podcasts would review the kind of language that they were doing in class every week. Obviously the kind of language that taxi drivers need if they're picking up tourists. So things like, how to find, where the tourist wants to go, from very simple things like that to slightly more complex things like recommendations for restaurants or for hotels or information about the city, this kind of thing. These learners had a fairly low level of English to start with. I think this is just a brilliant idea. How to use technology in a very simple way to reach these particular learners who found it difficult to always come to class. Not just that, but the learners could download the podcast onto their mobile devices, and then they could listen and listen and re-listen to these audio recordings as much as they wanted. So when Nergis did feedback on the project, she found the students just loved it. They had all this extra exposure to English outside of class. If they had to miss class, they could easily catch up. They had a very good model of the language because Nergis herself created these audio recordings for the students. And this seemed to me a really clever technological solution for a particular group of learners. And the technology itself is fairly low tech. You can very easily listen to podcasts on a low-end mobile phone. The students loved it. They really appreciated it. You can find Nergis Kern's work online very easily. You can just Google her name, Nergis Kern, Podcasts for Taxi Drivers. She has a website, she has articles she's written about the experience, well worth reading about. That's Nergis. This is Ayat Tawel, and she's based in Cairo, in Egypt. Ayat was working in a school that had no technology whatsoever, zero. She was interested, though, in doing something with her students. So she joined a wonderful group that I highly recommend called the Web Heads. The Web Heads. The Web Heads are a group of teachers from all over the world who have a kind of a Yahoo group, an email-based Yahoo group, and they just share ideas about how to use technology in language teaching. They are not technical people. They're teachers like we are, but they're interested in trying things out. So Ayat joined the Webheads, and she got in contact with all of these teachers from all over the world, including people like Nergis, doing interesting things with students. And she made a connection with a teacher in Argentina called Maria. Now, Ayat was teaching secondary school level. You can see her students there in the picture. The girls were aged between 12, 13, around there. And in the course book, they had a unit about South America. They had this reading text about the countries and the information and so on in South America. So Ayat thought it would be great to contact with Maria, who was also a secondary school teacher, and see if they could put the two classes together to talk about, well, South America for Ayat's teacher, but also for the Egyptian students to share something about their own country and their own culture. Now, the way it worked out was, of course, Egypt is in this part of the world, and Argentina, where Maria is in this part of the world, and the time zones are very different. So it was impossible to have the students in class online at the same time, of course. Yeah? It was night time in Egypt when Maria's students were in class. So what they did was Ayat's students prepared questions about South America to ask Maria, the teacher. The students prepared everything beforehand. The day that Ayat had one of her classes, Maria was available in Argentina, and they set up a very simple Skype interview. So you can see here the students are coming up one by one. Get the slide up. What's happened to our slides? There we go. The bottom picture, one of the students, you can see Maria's actually on that screen there, and the students are asking the questions that they have prepared to her, and everybody's noting down the answers. I mentioned before that there was no technology in Ayat's school, nothing. So you can see from the picture what she did. She basically brought in her own laptop computer. She had an internet USB key, or a dongle it's called. She had her own little sort of key to connect through the data plan. And she also had portable speakers, and she brought those in as the technology in the class. That's how she got around that problem. So the students interviewed Maria, and then they produced posters about Argentina and so on. Now, what happened was the students, they liked interviewing Maria, but they wanted to meet Maria's students because they were the same age. But because of the time difference, they couldn't do it via Skype. So Maria and Ayat set up a Facebook group, a closed Facebook group, just for their students to interact. And the students started sharing information and so on. And it turned out that the Argentinian students taught the Egyptian students a few simple phrases in Spanish, and the Egyptian students taught the Argentinian students a few simple phrases in Arabic. And they were very interested in each other's countries. And of course, English was the medium through which they could connect. Here is some of the feedback from Ayat's students. So the first one there, it says, this is what Ayat's students are saying about the project. They say, one of them says, it's good to know about other countries. I hope we can do it with other countries. Of course, this is the wonderful thing, isn't it, about the internet. It kind of opens the classroom to other contexts and other kids. The one under that, we learned a lot of things about Argentina and had a great deal of fun. The one on the left there, she had a different language. This is a student commenting on the interview with Maria, and what the student meant was the accent. She was not used to hearing a Spanish accent speaking in English. And then the last point there, it was very interesting, but I blamed myself that I haven't shared in that interview. This was a student who didn't prepare questions, right? They had had to prepare questions for homework. The student hadn't done it, and then, of course, missed out on all of the interview. So that's, again, interesting. The students were very, very motivated to use the questions that they'd prepared and to use English to really communicate with, a real person in Argentina. So here is, I just skipped one there. Here's the Facebook page that Maria and Ayat set up as well for the students on the right. So you have an idea. And that went on for a lot longer than they had expected, with the kids using that to communicate. Keep in mind that these are teenagers, 12, 13-year-olds, so the Facebook group was not public. It was a closed Facebook group, which meant that nobody had access to it unless they were invited. So in terms of protection and so on, that was all fine, easily dealt with. Okay, I think those two projects are lovely. They're very clear examples of teachers using technology that they have to hand to solve a kind of a linguistic issue or to expand the linguistic opportunities within the classroom. They're starting with, how do I help my students with language? They're not starting with, what technology shall I use? The technology that they use is a solution to how to support, if you like, their students' language learning. Excuse me. Okay, just to kind of pull this together, you yourselves using technology with students. Have any of you in the room used particularly things like mobile devices or Skype, the kinds of things we've seen? Have you used those with your students yourselves? Could you put up your hand? I can see. Quite a few of you. Okay, yeah. All right, well then you'll know that really if you do want to start experimenting in the way that Nergiz and Ayat did, you need to start small. You maybe take one class, like Ayat and Nergiz did, and you also ask your students what they need and what they have. So in the case of the taxi drivers, they all had low-end mobile phones. Some had smartphones, but not many. So the solution had to be aimed at low-end mobile phones. You need to ask yourself why. Establish why. Establish the learning aims. Why are you doing this? And I think in the case again of Nergiz and Ayat, it's very clear why they're doing it. They're motivating their students, providing them with extra practice, setting up real communicative opportunities and so on. And that is the driver behind these projects. Again, using simple and appropriate technology, we've talked about that. Having relevant and appropriate content as well. So for the taxi drivers, of course, the language that they're dealing with and that they need in their jobs. Work within the political realities. I'm thinking there of a case study that comes from Egypt at a university. At the time of the Arab Spring in Cairo, there was a stage where the students couldn't actually get to the university for their language classes because, you know, lockdowns and roadblocks and so on. So many of the teachers set up a virtual learning environment and put their language learning materials online so that the students were able to carry on with their language classes. So again, the technology was used to kind of overcome a specific situation, which was a short-term situation, but it was an effective short-term solution. And the last point, they're getting training and support, of course. It's difficult to do this kind of thing completely alone. If you are in a school with very limited technology or no technology, and you're the only teacher interested in doing something like this with your students, I really suggest you join the Webheads. They're a wonderful, wonderful group. If you just search Webheads or www.webheads.info, you'll find out about the group and you can just join. It's not run by anybody. It's just a kind of collective of teachers. Okay, let's go back to our 3 statements from the beginning. I'm going to give you 1 minute again to review these statements in the light of the examples that we've looked at, the projects that we've looked at, and to decide whether you agree or disagree. You may have changed your mind, you may not have changed your mind, that's fine, but just 1 minute to review these. Okay, I'm going to tell you what I think. The first one, you need the latest technologies to carry out good tech-based lessons or activities. I disagree. I think our projects have shown clearly that you don't need the latest technologies. You can use very low-end mobile phones, for example. You can use technologies like Skype that have been around for at least 10 years. So it's certainly, I would disagree with this statement. You can do interesting things with students with very low-end technologies, and we've seen examples. The second point there, technology is too expensive to use in EFL classes in many contexts. Again, I disagree. It depends on the technology. If we're talking about interactive whiteboards, then of course they're too expensive, and frankly, in my opinion, interactive whiteboards bring very little to the learning process. There is certainly no research that shows that interactive whiteboards make a difference to learning outcomes. But if we're talking about the technologies that we've just looked at, then they're not too expensive. Your students are already coming to class with mobile phones. Maybe not smartphones, maybe not every student has a phone or low-end mobile phone, but you can work in pairs. So again, I would disagree with that. The third point, using technologies effectively requires a non-traditional approach to teaching. We had some agree and disagree with this one earlier on. I would agree with that. I think the examples that we've looked at, especially the Ayat and Nerges examples, are non-traditional in that they prioritize communicative language, they put the learners at the center of the equation. It's not the teacher giving information to the students. Perhaps in Nerges's case, slightly different, there is a repository of English language that the students are accessing. But using new technologies doesn't always involve newer approaches to teaching. For example, some mobile phone apps can be quite behaviorist, based on repetition. For example, vocabulary apps on a mobile phone are fairly traditional. They're delivering content, they work on repetition, memorization, spaced repetition, and so on. And that's fine. There's a place for that, but students should be doing that on their own outside of class. In class, we can certainly use technology to support a more communicative approach, a less teacher-driven approach to learning. And again, the examples that we've looked at, I think, show that quite clearly. Okay, I'm going to leave you with my contact details if you'd like to drop me an email or have a look at our website. Also, if you'd like some resources connected to this idea of low resource contexts, there's some information on this link. This is the time to take a photo of the screen. On the resources link, you'll find more projects than those I've had time to explain to you. And you will also find links to the videos that I've shown you, if you'd like to look at those again. I think we've finished a little bit early, but I think that's okay, maybe 5 minutes early. I'd just like to thank you very much for coming. I hope to see you in my workshop tomorrow. I'm delighted to be in Algeria, and I'm looking forward to actually chatting to many of you over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.